This
in with
conference
us
will now be recorded.
From all kinds of different places. So I'd like to welcome everyone to the Newfoundland and Labrador Association of Professional Planners, Planners Plate, with our presenter Jill Snow from CMHC. Planners Plate is an occasional speaker series held here in Newfoundland and Labrador on topics related to urban and rural planning. It formerly was an in-person luncheon, but we've transitioned to this virtual model with a lot of help from the Atlantic Planners Institute. And this is now a regional initiative. So thanks to API for all of their technical assistance. The topic today is on the impacts of COVID-19 on affordable housing, and Jill Snow, CMHC's outreach specialist for Atlantic Canada, is our presenter. So Jill has worked with many housing stakeholders across the region to create affordable housing solutions under the National Housing Strategy in the local community. During the presentation, really feel free to use the chat function to send in questions or comments, and part of my role is going to be keeping track of those and feeding them to Jill either during the presentation or at the end of the presentation. And after Jill's presentation, we'll have a time for discussion and questions and answers. At that time, really feel free to unmute yourselves and pose those questions verbally to see if we can get a little bit of a discussion going. So on those, I'll turn it over to Jill. And Jill, thanks very much again to coming to present to us with the Planner's Plate. We can't hear, Jill, we can't hear you.
Oh, sorry about that. I wanted to say thank you, Elaine, and I wanted to let you know as well, I think I may have accidentally pressed the record button while you were speaking. So I don't know if you want the call recorded, and if so, certainly if anyone has any issues with that, to let us know. I don't know if I can just stop recording. Maybe Dylan can help with that. Is everyone hearing me now?
Yeah, everyone can hear you now, Jill. And okay. API does record and presents these presentations on digitally afterwards. They'll present a link for everyone.
Perfect. Yeah, I wasn't sure if I did that in error or if it was supposed to be done. So, so
I think okay, API did that.
Excellent. Well, I guess we can get started. Hello, everybody. It's great to be back. I know I spoke with you, I think it was just before Christmas. Time seems to be a little bit of a blur here lately. Might have been, I'm not sure. Anyway, it's great to be here today. Again, as Elaine said, I'm Jill Snow. I'm the outreach specialist for Atlantic Canada with CMHC. And I'm really pleased to be here today to talk COVID-19 on affordable housing. I certainly, as many of you probably wish that we could be talking about something else and that we didn't have to reference COVID-19, but here we are. And I don't think I'll spend a whole lot of time on, you know, talking about the overall impact of COVID that is having on our lives. I'm sure we can all feel that, but I will certainly as it relates to housing. Our homes, you know, they've been doing all sorts of things lately. The space and using our space for things that it wasn't meant for, like school and work and physical activity, and oftentimes all at once. I've heard a quote several times, and I'm sure many of you have heard it through the pandemic. It's I heard it through, I mean, there's different memes, and I think I had originally heard it from a poem that was dubbed the COVID-19 poem. but that we're all experiencing the same storm, but in a different boat. And I can't think of any better description to talk about the impact of COVID and to set the stage for our discussion here today as it relates to housing. If we look at regions across the country, different cities and provinces, we've all certainly been affected quite differently. But one thing that's been really consistent is the inequity in housing. The challenges around homelessness and affordable housing, they've been growing and have been in existence for decades, but the pandemic has certainly amplified them. And if you look at those who have a stable home versus those with unstable housing, the difference has become much more exaggerated and visible throughout the pandemic. Things like, and I'd be remiss not to mention those that are dealing with evictions. Despite moratoriums right across the country, it really elevates the seriousness for those that have had to deal with evictions. I read an article the other day, and they had said so many of us are tired of looking at the same walls, but there's so many more people who are just praying that they get to keep those walls. So eviction being a big concern across the country and around the world. Those living with abusive relationships are certainly very significantly impacted by the pandemic through isolation restrictions. And current shelters aren't always conducive to distancing and have had to see their numbers be limited and reduction of spaces. So I think we can all agree that the difference and the challenges that have come with the pandemic related to housing is quite significant. Certainly to address these challenges, it's going to take, as we've talked about ever since, forever, but certainly since the launch of the National Housing Strategy, it's going to take all levels of government, individuals and businesses. We continue to need to come together, innovate funding and policy solutions to really help these issues going forward. So let's dive into maybe what specifically the impact has been to affordable housing in Atlantic Canada. We can explore the impacts, and I think for our discussion today, let's look at maybe the housing as a whole, including home ownership and near the end of the presentation, I'll dive into a number of the solutions that have been created thus far to support the significant impacts of COVID on housing. So I'm just going to move forward here. The pandemic also brought with it challenges. It was really a kind of an unprecedented uncertainty around being able to predict economic and housing outlooks. And we released Outlook, you may have read last summer in 2020. And I just wanted to share this quote with you by our Deputy Chief Economist at the time, because Elaine and I were chatting just before we got started, and so much has changed as I prepared for this discussion today. There's been a lot of changes even since the short 9 months ago. At the time, COVID had been said to have unprecedented impacts on Canada's housing market, with a lot of short-term uncertainty that was going to lead to severe declines in housing activity, sales activity, and new construction. And as the virus is overcome, cities would bounce back, but there would be significant uncertainty with respect to the path and the timing of that recovery. And I think that uncertainty still exists today. The precise timing or the speed of the recovery is going to vary considerably because the trajectory of the pandemic is still largely unknown. So bearing that in mind, we'll chat about what has the impacts have been in Atlantic Canada to date, and then we can look at what the future of housing might look like. And I'm going to weave through the discussion some overall Canadian, evidence of the impacts, as well as Atlantic Canada, because there's a lot of consistency between the two, but as I mentioned, there certainly is some variability across the country. And in order to control the spread of COVID-19, the best medicine has been to really just stay at home. It's really altered the how and where we work, as well as led to a lot of questions about how and where we want to live. So we're seeing the trends around rural and suburban areas being a desired location for their bigger backyards and larger living spaces. we're seeing across the country downtown markets that are previously in high demand that have increased and are flooding with supply. We've seen the flow of immigrants that typically fuels demand for housing be significantly. So let's look specifically at Atlantic and see what's happened in those areas, as they are key indicators of housing demand. So if you've ever seen Chris Janes, our senior economist analyst speak, he refers to PIE, and I thought that acronym's always stuck with me as the drivers of housing demand, so population, income, and employment. And I certainly don't profess to know as much as him or all the ins and outs of market housing data, but I'll certainly share some with you and talk about kind of the higher level trends that we're pulling from that data. If you have any specific or technical questions, I will, if I don't know the answer, I'll certainly get it for you when it comes to the data itself. So let's dig into the population for Atlantic Canada. So if we look at year over year and between 2020 and 2019, we've seen some slowing, still some growth with exception to Newfoundland and Labrador. However, even Newfoundland, that was a slower decline than the previous year. So although we've seen a slower growth and very modest numbers, when we look into kind of what's impacting that, where we normally see our sources of population is typically from, it's typically from migration, it's typically from students that have come into the provinces in Atlantic. With regards to, if we look at right across Canada, immigration is lower on a whole. We've seen in Atlantic Canada more of a stabilization of immigration. So the numbers haven't really fluctuated dramatically where they may have increased in the past. And that's created an impact on the rental market. So we've seen some increases in vacancies based on the stabilized population growth, but we expect that to be sort of a spike in the short term. If we look longer term, we're expecting medium to long term that the rental demand will return. We do see in the Atlantic provinces a reduced out migration right now based on the decreased mobility that COVID-19 has brought. We've seen a slowing of international students coming to the Atlantic provinces, and that's largely based on travel restrictions, but also on the delivery of university education. That the online model has really impacted the rental demand and need for student housing right across the Atlantic provinces. We've also seen a bit of a trend related to mobility across the country when it comes to population. We're not seeing as many short-term accommodation rentals with the travel restrictions being in demand. So with that, we're looking at possibly some of them converting to longer-term rentals and an increase in supply across the country. So again, we've talked about the condo market. That's an example of that in some of the other major markets across the country. When it comes to the income, the impacts of the pandemic on our income, if we take more of a Canadian view, I wanted, because I think there's some consistency in the higher level themes here right through Atlantic Canada as well. The pandemic has had an uneven impact across sectors and workers. So this slide is a little bit busy, and I won't get into the mechanics of the data itself, just to highlight some of the overall themes that we're seeing through the data. So we're seeing that uneven impact amongst sectors and workers. We all saw that millions of jobs really virtually disappeared last year between February and April in Canada. And a lot of them were in the high contact or primarily the service industries, as well as low wage workers were employed in these sectors and were hardest hit and created the most housing insecurity across the country for those. Jobs for workers earning less than $16 an hour fell about 27% in 2020, which is almost 5 times the decline in overall employment. So very significant impact on the lower wage earners. The hospitality and retail trade sectors, and we've seen that right across Atlantic Canada, explain about 30% of the shortfall in employment income, and less than 10% can be attributed to sectors at the top of the wage scale. So we talked about those differences. It's very clear from an employment and income perspective. Canadians did lose an average of $1,600 in labor income over 2020. However, when you take the direct fiscal support through the federal government, the drop in disposable income was more than offset by the programs that were in place. So resulting in the disposable income actually rising across Canada based on those support programs. Interestingly, I wanted to point out the importance of remote work. So it's evident during the crisis that a lot of workers could continue, as most of us are here today, doing our usual tasks from home. And interestingly, if you look at if you break that down by income level, working from home increases as personal income increases. So the higher a person's salary, the most likely they're able to continue to work from home and maintain that income, meaning they were less impacted from an income and a housing stability perspective. If we drill into Atlantic Canada a little more closely, just to give you a sense of that impact of remote working, we've taken a few points in time over 2020 and looked at the difference in those that the percentage of people that work from home, and very few prior to the pandemic were working from home. You can see that changed significantly over 2020. Many businesses adapted their workforce to be able to work from a home environment. And I wanted to share that in light of that previous slide highlighting how the higher earners are more easily to adapt to that new working environment. So again, drilling into the impacts of employment in Atlantic Canada. So we've looked at 2 of the drivers so far, one of them being modest increases in population growth, if any, in Newfoundland, for instance. We've looked at income loss being higher amongst the lower wage earners, recognizing that the federal support programs have helped to compensate for that loss in income. And the third driver around employment, I was looking at a recent APEC report, and it highlighted the rural communities are more vulnerable to the crisis by having more of their workforce concentrated in that harder hit service industry. And for the first time since the pandemic, we looked at EI claims, and they're higher than the national average on a year-over-year comparison. When we look at business closures across Atlantic Canada, they rose by 9% in November of 2020, and we've seen increases in all 4 Atlantic provinces, most notably in Newfoundland at 18%. And that's largely driven by the cancellation of large projects and depressed commodity prices. But we're seeing closures right across all of the provinces. We've certainly seen some impact to the accommodation and food service industry with weak employment, and available jobs in sales and service has gone down about 14%. So, far away from full recovery on some of these employment data figures. So you may have heard, well, let's go back to the summer of 2020 and look at our housing market outlook that I referenced earlier. It talked about severe declines in activity. And you may have read recently in our local news here in Atlantic Canada and certainly in Newfoundland that activity doesn't seem to be slowing. So, indicators across the country have been impacted, maybe a little more modestly so here in Atlantic Canada based on the measures we just talked about. But the activity is still happening with regards to housing, and I think there's some key factors that's driving that. I don't have the stats to show you with regards to the sales activity, but I'll just note a couple here. New construction activity is relatively the same or better, with exception of Newfoundland, right across Atlantic Canada. MLS average prices are up for 2020, anywhere between 3 and 18.7% across Atlantic Canada, depending on the province. And MLS sales are up year over year in Atlantic Canada. So what's driving that? And these are the key factors that we think are driving it. It partly reflects some pent up demand. So there was some supply, and then there was some lagging demand from the early months of the pandemic. And there's some uneven impacts right across income groups. So we're seeing some shifts from the desire, and I touched on that earlier, around the composition of housing. So people are looking for larger spaces, recognizing that this may be a longer term venture, working from home. Looking for dedicated office space, especially if you have children or others within the household, you're trying to work while they're there as well. Looking for maybe segregated units within the house, so that if there's a need for isolation or self-quarantining within the family. Looking for larger outdoor space or home gyms, places for remote learning and maybe extended family that needs to stay to help out with other responsibilities. Some other trends that we're seeing are, looking at, and that kind of compositional shift also kind of pairs with those looking to move out of the major markets to rural areas. So we're seeing that in New Brunswick and other areas across Atlantic, where people want to move more to the rural or other locations closer to family and so forth. With regards to higher income households, they've largely quickly adapted to the pandemic. They were able to maintain their income, as we talked about. They were able to benefit from historical savings and low mortgage rates, which can help keep the optimism around purchasing a home. There's also, with travel restrictions, the ability to save more for those who were able to maintain their income. And as I'm sure you've seen, the real estate industry has really shifted as well to provide video tours and be able to compensate for that lack of mobility or the risk in visiting and exploring other houses. Other options. Now, renters have been impacted a little differently. Typically, you'll see your lower wage earners in that rental situation, and likely they have had to maybe accept higher rents because they've maybe not being able to go seek out other options with mobility restrictions, or that higher rent is even further hindering their ability to purchase a home or get access to home ownership. So it's very, very different depending on your situation. Also, you might have heard about they are up year over year in all the provinces. And what's driving this is the demand for mortgages, and it's putting upward pressure on housing prices because there's lower interest rates and cost of borrowing. But also there's been some very significant disruption in the supply chain logistics around building houses and materials, such as lumber, as I'm sure you've heard. Some shortages because of those that are investing any of their savings into their home, as well as the cost of new safety protocols on job sites. So all of that together is really contributing to that higher price point, an average price point across the region. As well, if we look at, I think we covered all that piece actually. So that's a lot of the trends that we're noticing and the factors that are driving the activity in the housing market. I'll dive now into the impact on the future of housing. So again, we're seeing some and hearing discussions around trends that we expect will take place in housing going forward. Whether the changes that we're experiencing now are permanent or is really undetermined at this stage, but one thing is certain, 2020, the impact has been considerable on the housing market. We may have held a little more steady in Atlantic Canada, especially with the federal government support, but it's largely, unknown as to the length of time and how this is going to play out in terms of the pandemic. So some of the things that have been talked about with regards to trends around housing is a shift. We talked about the shift from a compositional standpoint, but also the shift in demand of the type of home. So keep hearing this term, ground-oriented home. So kind of getting away from that high-rise multi-unit where there's more density and moving to single, semi-detached, or row housing is a trend we're hearing across Canada. We're also hearing, again, I mentioned it a couple times, that kind of move to rural shift, looking for that different type of access to larger yards and houses and space. We also see, I touched on it, I think, early in the discussion with regards to shelters. So we're seeing, you know, over the last year, housing advocates, supporters, and frontline workers have worked tirelessly to help people stay safe during the pandemic. And they've used it really, there's been some progress accelerated through ending homelessness. And I read an article, I think, through the Alliance to End Homelessness last week and saw some of the accomplishments that they've made. You know, within weeks of the pandemic, communities launched rapid rehousing initiatives, additional emergency shelters, isolation and quarantining spaces, and there's been a lot of federal to help that effort. As well, I read something about, and it kind of struck me funny at first with regards to huggable homes, and I thought, you know, what does that mean? And really, that's kind of from a design perspective, I think, where we've had to get used to not touching and not hugging and all of these things through the pandemic. There's some design or interest around design to creating homes that are more, you know, cushiony and textural and tactile. So I've seen some kind of trends towards that as well. And this one might be a little more dramatic, but seeing some trends around people who want to be transitory. You know, if housing is going to be a place where you have to stay, maybe living in a way where you can move that house easily to other areas. So just having more mobility within the home itself. So those are some impacts on where we live. If we look at the impacts on urban planning and development, which I know you guys are spending, you know, a lot of your time focused on. It's funny, I listened to someone yesterday, and they were a planner, and they talked about, they made a joke at the beginning of the discussion, and they said, and I feel like it might be funnier coming from a planner, so I won't try to do much with it, but he said that, you know, we're all on Zoom here today working from home. You know, it feels like we're doing something illegal. We're in single family homes that specifically prohibit business operations, but here we are. So I just thought that was a cute joke that played into this part of the discussion. So one of the things that we're anticipating and seeing and hearing talked about across the country is wider sidewalks, so giving more ability for distancing. As well, the 15-minute neighborhood. So many of you are likely familiar with this concept, but having neighborhoods where, and I feel like I live in one because I live in Stavanger area and I have a lot of these things, but in areas where you can shop, work, do your recreation, your cultural, all within a short walk or bike ride from your home. Sort of expanding that access and pedestrian friendly type services within a 15-minute neighborhood in your area. The other trend we're hearing a lot about is building, and we've seen this, building in amenities within multi-unit buildings. So having, you know, it's becoming more popular to have, you know, co-working spaces, community gardens, and delivery sports within the multi-unit building. Also, possibly increased elevator capacity to allow for more distancing. And, you know, the talk I listened to yesterday was really focused on, what are we going to do with all this office and commercial space? Is there a potential for reuse around affordable housing or different types of housing if this model of working from home stays even after the pandemic has hopefully been resolved? So, you know, so just some things to consider around urban planning and development. So I did say that I was going to talk about how CMHC and municipalities are going to support households during the pandemic. And you may have seen some media around some of these and experienced some of these supports yourself. With regards to landlords and tenants, there was quickly a program put in place by the federal government called the Canada Emergency Commercial Rent Assistance Program. We delivered it for a short time, and it's since been transferred to CRA, I believe, and that was to help with regards to commercial rent specifically. Other supports was around helping homeowners and figuring out what to do if they were experiencing mortgage difficulties, we did put in place a call for ban on evictions. We did have opportunities for mortgage payment deferrals through lenders and supported that effort. We've looked at loan payment deferrals as well for Indigenous and Northern housing clients. And more money was added to the insured mortgage purchase program, which helps support the stability of lenders. So a number of different supports that we've delivered through CMHC. And if you're interested in learning more, I've included the website. I am going to share the presentation afterwards, and you'll be able to link up to some of these resources if you're interested in learning more. And certainly I'm available to talk anytime as well. I would be remiss to note that municipalities yourselves have really played a role in supporting the households during the pandemic and supporting their well-being. I know some of the waivers that have been put in place, and I sort of list all of the measures. We have kind of compiled some best practices across the country around policy tools, financial tools, and regulatory tools. So I'm happy to speak to you directly in your specific municipality to talk about what you're doing and what you may want to implement based on the best practices of other municipalities. So we've seen your support throughout the pandemic as well. And I'd like to touch on the National Housing Strategy opportunities. So I talked at the beginning about having innovation around housing policies and solutions and programs. When I send out the presentation, I'll also send a soft copy of this document. This is only a portion of it. I just wanted to give you an idea of how many solutions were available under the National Housing Strategy that we're delivering directly. But just to give you kind of a high-level overview, because I believe I was in to speak with you maybe last year, and we went into a little detail on each of the programs. We still have the seed funding to support affordable housing projects that really focus on those pre-construction costs. And we also have some preservation funding that helps with the pre-construction costs for those that are, or maintenance costs for those that are on operating agreements. And we're delivering still directly the National Housing Co-Investment Fund, and that's one where we ask for a partnership with yourselves as a municipality. And again, we can go back to those best practices, some very simple things municipalities can be doing to encourage affordable housing, as well as helping your developers or a nonprofit or housing community providers check a box in terms of qualifying for the National Housing Co-Investment Fund money. So that's something we can certainly talk about, how you could easily help that effort. We also have the Federal Lands Initiative. There isn't any land available right now in Atlantic Canada as of last week, I believe. But there's always surplus lands being made available. Similar to, I think we've talked here locally in Newfoundland and St. John specifically about some surplus lands that are going to be offered for the purpose of affordable housing. The Rental Construction Financing Initiative is a supply program that's being utilized across the country, and we recently received an additional, I believe it was 15 million. It's 70. I'll have to look up that number. The total funding over across all programs under the National Housing Strategy is now up to 70 billion over a 10-year period, and I believe there's 8 years remaining in the strategy. And the rental construction was topped up significantly to provide more funding to help inject supply in various municipalities of affordable housing. And then the last couple of programs we have relate to insurance and how we can support lenders in providing flexible terms for those who want to get involved in affordable housing. So just to remind you that those programs exist to help as we move out of the pandemic. We do a lot of our application process online, and we can meet certainly over conference call or whatever is easy, telephone, to be able to help you put these projects together. So if you have someone that you're working with in your community and you don't need to remember all the ins and outs of the programs other than that we have funding available, and I'd be happy to talk to them about their projects specifically. So we also are available on Twitter and YouTube and Facebook and LinkedIn, all the social media sites. We do have our CMHC main website as well, which I've linked here. I think you're going to see a revamp of that in the coming weeks to make it even easier for you to access our tools for housing providers. Lots of information there, and we're going to streamline it to make it easier to access in the coming weeks. So there's my contact information. I encourage you to jot that down. Love to open it up. I saw some comments coming through as I was chatting. I guess, Elaine, I don't know if I can't see the chat box on my end, so I'll open it up for comments, questions. I'd love to hear, so I talked about the Canadian-wide impact of COVID on housing and some of Atlantic Canada impacts, but I'd love to hear what's impacting your region specifically, or your municipality, what you've seen, and have a discussion around that. So I believe we have, a little bit of time left. I think that I came in right around the 40-minute mark there, Elaine. So I'll pass it back to you and look forward to having a discussion.
All right, Jill, thanks very much for that presentation and a really good overview of the impacts of COVID-19 from what the expectations were to what the reality is today, and how things have evolved. We can certainly see that. I'm sure the municipalities across the province are seeing some of those impacts. And certainly on our personal lives, I'm sure that there's been people looking for work or wanting to move, or, looking for different housing options to accommodate working from home or schooling from home and all of that. So I'd certainly be interested, like you, to hear from some of the municipalities about building permits. Has there been any changes in housing design? So anyone feel free to chime in. So Jill, for me, one of the things that I saw was really interesting in your presentation was about the 15-meter for the broader, wider sidewalk, the 5-meter sidewalk. And I think we've all experienced that when walking as our daily activity, with people scooting out of your way and trying to move strollers around to maintain social separation distances. Do you think that that's going to have traction for new developments?
Oh, you've cut it, Elaine. I only heard part of the question.
So I was just talking a little bit about the 15-minute, 5-meter sidewalk, and about whether that would have any traction for new development.
I guess that's a good question to put out to the membership, where it's something that we're hearing a lot about as an opportunity, and I think in line with that, and I know we've all probably sat in on discussions around the accessibility piece, and we've seen accessible neighborhoods where you've got the sidewalks more even to the ground versus the curb. I don't know if that's commonplace everywhere or not, but I've heard that accessible feature being talked about in relation to sidewalks and community planning. So I don't know. I don't know where would the membership feel that do they feel the traction would come in terms of a wider sidewalk? I guess, that would involve somewhat of an increased cost. Got a quiet group today.
Yeah, each municipality has their own kind of street profiles, and
Yeah.
whether there's any talk about changing those or accommodating, bigger accessibility, greater separation distances. I don't know. You'd have to hear from someone within a municipal function there.
Yeah. It's sort of something that I've heard about in the discussions around the impacts of COVID-19. But yeah, it'd be interesting to see if it's implementable.
It's Stefan here. It's Stefan here. Yeah, the one thing I think goes beyond just sidewalk design. I think it actually goes into the whole discussion about open space considerations, and I don't mean just parks, but plazas and so on. We have a lot of spaces within our urban centers where we do have small spaces that we use for a multiple variety of purposes. I think when we talk about looking at expanding widths of sidewalks, like I said earlier, it goes beyond that. And how do we use these spaces? What should be the minimum size of these spaces, and to be able to use them in a very safe and healthy manner? And that's something that takes a bit of time and thinking as we go through this pandemic. Thank you.
Very good point. Yeah, great point. Yeah, there's going to be more of an outward focus versus just the composition within the home. But we've seen with all the restrictions the need for even adjusting out, beyond the sidewalk, as you say, Stefan. Nice to hear your voice.
Yeah, Jill, the other thing, I know this is not your area of expertise, but another thing I think that might be interesting in terms of going forward with the pandemic is the whole use of public transit in terms of housing location. I know here in the St. John's area, we're still grappling with trying to improve the type of public transit system we have in terms of ridership, in terms of proper networks and so on. And we're still engaged in that. And I don't think we have yet brought together the whole concept. I know we're working on it, but the whole concept of where your transit lines are and where your mixed development or your higher forms of housing development are that can avail of the public transit systems, especially in times like these when you do have a lot of low-income individuals, as your charts were showing you, that can't necessarily afford to stay home. They do have to get to work, and they have to get to work usually by public transit, some other kind of form of transportation. So I think there needs to be rethinking in that area as well as we go forward.
Yeah, I agree 100%. Yeah, we've sort of always kind of put things in boxes, right? So housing, office space, shopping, and not everybody has that ability to flow freely between them. So very, very good point.
Well, and especially if the reuse of office buildings moves to a more high housing.
Yeah, and I think that does present some challenges in terms of conversion, of course. However, there are funding programs, the ones that I mentioned, also some of them cover repair and renewal of existing properties, or conversion of existing properties. So there's, we just saw recently the Rapid Housing Initiative that's now since closed, of course, but we may see, we had a very large demand for the dollars that were available, and we may see some future funding under that stream. I have no way of knowing that, but that's the thought process around it with such demand. And part of that program included conversion of non-residential spaces. So there is a recognition that funding and support is required But yeah, that's certainly an area where I think we can create some supply, especially if that model of working from home doesn't shift back, or back to the office, right? I
Jill,
think somebody,
yep,
yeah, sorry, go ahead.
Thank you for a wonderful presentation. There's something that doesn't jive with me with this, which is that our population is declining, or at best staying stable, and it's getting older.
Mm-hmm.
And yet housing prices are going up.
I know.
So it sounds to me like it's a bubble. Like at some point, this thing will have to readjust itself. So we're going to have older people in big homes selling and moving into smaller homes or assisted living places. Yet we have people with low income who can afford to buy a home. Like, what's your best sense of how this is all going to settle?
I wish I had that crystal ball. It's a very good point, and it is, those drivers are not giving the, I think it was in our rental market report, it's very inconsistent to what should be happening as a result of the drivers of housing from a population perspective. I'd feel more comfortable, I think, leaving the predicting to our experts. So I can certainly reach out to Chris Janes and his group and see where he thinks, what a response to that question might be. And I don't want to use it as a cop-out. I just don't feel as qualified as where he's looking at these measures regularly and over a number of years. I wouldn't want to say something and
another factor, Jill, it was in the paper recently, and in fact, my son and daughter-in-law are facing the same thing. They're looking for a summer home outside the city, and prices are going up there as well. So again, it doesn't make sense to me that at some point this trend will exhaust itself, and then I don't know if there's a crash coming or what. Unless immigration comes in a big way, it just seems to me that we're going to have way more housing than we have need for it.
Yeah. I mean, looking at the traditional, supply demand and the drivers of housing, that isn't unreasonable to say that it's, how long could this persist in this situation, and it's certainly bucking all the normal trends. But I'm happy to reach out to our economists to give more of a, because I agree with you, and I believe if we look into the, I'd like to look it up actually, because I think that's exactly what was said in many of the rental reports for Atlantic Canada, is that it's not playing out the way we would expect it to in terms of prices or sales. Based on the population, the income, and the employment in the region.
Right.
Yeah.
Thanks.
And Jill, I'm going to reach out as well to CMHC to do another planner's plate exactly about market trends. So hopefully we'll have that scheduled once this fiscal year comes to an end. Perfect.
Yeah. He, that would be a wonderful, like, Chris is a wealth of knowledge when it comes to that. And I don't know, I'm sort of suspecting that he may feel uncertain as well, in terms of just the fact that we don't know the full trajectory of the pandemic impacts yet. So, he may, I'm not sure if he'll be able to give an opinion at this stage. He may, but I'll reach out and just see if I can get some kind of feelers around the issue, because I certainly feel the same way. It doesn't add,
because certainly one of the things that we'd need to consider as well as the economic drivers with the oil and other big investments here in Newfoundland and Labrador, at least.
Exactly, yeah. And he follows those quite closely. So yeah, I'm going to reach out and maybe Elaine, I don't know if I can send those to you directly to get out if he has a response that he'd like to share.
Yes, and then you send them to me and I get them posted. Like I'll get your presentation, Jill, with your permission, posted on the API website. And just for the participants that are online, API does post all of these presentations. It's got its own YouTube channel, and all of these presentations as presented are there for people to go back to look at some of your slides in a bit more detail, or those that weren't online can visit those and hear your presentation. So that's a good outreach.
Yeah, and Mike, I believe I have your contact information, so I'll follow up with you directly. And then, like you said, Elaine, Chris will be hopefully available to speak to the group at a later date.
Thanks.
No problem.
At some point in the future. All right.
Yes.
So just beginning to wind down here now. So are there any last questions for Jill, or for any issues that we would, you'd like to raise with her? Feel free to send them in chat, or you can her question.
Yeah, before you finish, Elaine, I do have one more question. Stefan here again. Just has CMHC done any work, Jill, on architectural considerations of multi-story buildings given the pandemic and the issues of using elevators and width of corridors and those kind of things? Has CMHC done any work in that area?
I'll check with our research group on that. I know they're actively working on many different different topics related to the pandemic. I haven't seen anything yet, but that doesn't mean it's not in the works or in existence. So I'll reach out to our research folks, and I have your I believe I have your contact information.
I believe you do, Jill. Yep.
Yeah. So we'll I'll follow up with you on that, and if I uncover something that we can share with the group as well, Elaine, I'll let you know.
Yeah, thank you, Jill.
No problem.
So everyone.
Oh, just Elaine, sorry, I just saw one last question in the chat group. Keith had offered around housing mobility. So the movable houses, that was more of an article I saw with regards to someone who had kind of felt, you know, I don't think you're going to see this as a major trend across the country. Housing mobility they were speaking from the standpoint of having to be in one place all the time. So this particular person had taken to the road with, you know, a tent and all their belongings, and kind of decided to live in different areas that were close to people that they could communicate with. I think that's probably a little bit of a stretch from what we'll see in terms of a trend per se, but I thought I would note it just because it was something that came up in some research I was doing, and I thought it was interesting, but probably not something that most are gonna take to in the short term anyway.
So what I'm certainly seeing is that there's a lot of people that are using Airbnbs or temporary housing to establish their households, and are moving mobility like that. Not necessarily taking their house, but taking their families.
Yes. Yeah, I should have been more clear on my example there. Sorry about that. I didn't mean to mislead.
Anyway, everyone, thank you very much for your participation, and thanks to Jill for joining us again. That was a really interesting presentation and a good overview of some of the challenges, not only here and now, but as the pandemic begins to transition and wind down, and how we're all trying to transition and adapt to the circumstances. So Jill, thanks very much from NLAPP.
Oh, my pleasure. Anytime. Nice to see everyone, and we'll hopefully see you again soon.
All right, thanks very much. Thanks everyone for participating.
Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Bye. Thanks, Jill.
Thank you, Elaine.
Talk soon. Thank you.